Buenos Aires, 1910. The Gran Teatro Colón stood illuminated against the evening sky, its Italian marble facade reflecting the glow of electric street lamps. Horse-drawn carriages lined the cobblestone avenue, each one carrying men in tailored European suits and women draped in Parisian silks. Inside the opera house, the wealthy elite sipped champagne imported from France, discussing their latest investments in railroads and cattle ranches that stretched endlessly across the Pampas. This scene would have fit perfectly in London or Paris. Except this wasn't Europe. This was Argentina. And at this moment in history, the average Argentine was richer than the average French citizen, wealthier than most Germans, and living better than nearly anyone in Italy. The numbers told an almost unbelievable story. Between 1880 and 1913, Argentina's economy grew at 6% annually. The fertile plains produced wheat and beef that fed a hungry Europe. Refrigerated ships carried Argentine meat across the Atlantic, filling the dinner tables of workers in Manchester and Madrid. Foreign capital poured into the country like a golden river. British investors built railways connecting the ports to the interior. The nation's GDP per capita climbed higher than France, Germany, and Italy. Buenos Aires transformed into something extraordinary. Wide boulevards mimicked the Champs-Élysées. Grand department stores sold luxury goods from around the world. The city built more theaters per capita than almost anywhere on Earth. Architects from Europe designed mansions for cattle barons who had grown obscenely rich selling beef to the old world. Immigrants flooded in from Spain and Italy, chasing the Argentine dream that seemed more achievable than its American counterpart. But wealth creates illusions. The golden facade of Buenos Aires concealed fundamental weaknesses that few bothered to examine. The economy depended almost entirely on agricultural exports. When European markets sneezed, Argentina caught pneumonia. The government borrowed heavily from British and French banks to fund infrastructure projects, assuming the good times would last forever. Political power concentrated in the hands of a small oligarchy who controlled the land and the export trade. Beneath the champagne toasts and opera performances, a dangerous pattern had already begun. The panic hit Buenos Aires on a spring morning in 1890. Crowds gathered outside the Banco Nacional, pressing against its iron gates. Rumors had spread through the city overnight. The banks were failing, the government couldn't pay its debts, and fortunes built over decades were evaporating. The collapse came suddenly, but the seeds had been planted years earlier. Argentina had borrowed enormous sums from European banks to build railways across the Pampas. The projects made sense on paper. Railroads would connect remote ranches to port cities, making exports more efficient and profitable. But the government miscalculated badly. They borrowed in gold-backed British pounds while earning revenue in Argentine pesos. When global commodity prices dropped, the math turned catastrophic. In London, Baring Brothers Bank held massive amounts of Argentine debt. The prestigious institution had financed railways, ports, and government bonds. When Argentina couldn't make its payments, Baring Brothers teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. The crisis threatened to bring down the entire British financial system. The Bank of England had to organize an emergency rescue to prevent a complete meltdown. Argentina had triggered the first emerging market debt crisis in modern history. The government officially defaulted, unable to meet its obligations to foreign creditors. The peso collapsed, losing half its value in months. Banks shuttered their doors. Construction projects halted mid-build, leaving skeletal frameworks rusting in the sun. Unemployment surged as foreign investment dried up completely. Riots erupted in Buenos Aires. Angry mobs attacked government buildings, demanding answers from politicians who had promised endless prosperity. The president resigned. Political chaos followed the economic disaster. The crisis of 1890 should have served as a warning. A nation cannot borrow indefinitely against future earnings, especially when those earnings depend on factors beyond its control. But Argentina would recover from this default, restructure its debts, and within 2 decades, return to borrowing as if nothing had happened. The first crack in the foundation had appeared. No one realized it would become a chasm that would swallow the country repeatedly for the next century. The 20th century turned Argentina into a laboratory for economic self-destruction. The pattern that emerged would repeat with mechanical precision, as if the country had locked itself into a machine it couldn't escape. The 1930s brought the Great Depression crashing into Argentina's export-dependent economy. European demand for beef and wheat vanished overnight. Government revenues collapsed. In September 1930, military officers overthrew the elected president, marking the first of many coups that would plague the country for decades. The new regime immediately suspended debt payments, another default 40 years after the first. Political instability became the norm. Military juntas alternated with weak civilian governments. Each new administration inherited economic problems and made them worse by printing money to fund spending they couldn't afford. The peso, once a symbol of Argentine wealth, began its long descent into worthlessness. Then came Juan Perón. The charismatic colonel seized power in 1946 and implemented a populist program that would haunt Argentina for generations. Perón nationalized industries, expanded the government workforce, and increased wages dramatically. He promised workers a larger share of the national wealth, and for a few years it seemed to work. But Perón funded these programs by running the printing presses day and night. Inflation crept upward, then accelerated into double digits. By the 1950s and 1960s, something unprecedented was happening. Middle-class Argentines went to the market with bags of cash to buy groceries before prices changed again. Shopkeepers marked up prices weekly, then daily. Workers demanded wage increases just to keep pace with the rising cost of living, which triggered more inflation in an endless spiral. The government responded by printing more money, making the problem exponentially worse. Military coups in 1955, 1962, 1966, and 1976 punctuated the chaos. Each junta promised to restore order and fix the economy. Each one failed. By 1982, Argentina's military government had accumulated $43 billion in foreign debt. In a desperate attempt to distract from economic catastrophe and shore up nationalist support, the generals invaded the Falkland Islands, a British territory in the South Atlantic. The war lasted 74 days and ended in humiliating defeat. Argentine soldiers, many of them poorly trained conscripts, surrendered to British forces. The military regime collapsed in disgrace. The country returned to civilian rule, but the economic damage was complete. In 1982, Argentina defaulted again, suspending payments on all foreign debt. A clear pattern had crystallized. Borrow heavily to fund unsustainable spending. Print money when tax revenues fall short. Watch inflation spiral out of control, default on debts when the scheme collapses. Then start the cycle again with new promises and new loans from creditors with short memories. Every decade brought the same disaster wrapped in different political packaging. The curse had become permanent. December 19, 2001. Downtown Buenos Aires burned. Protesters smashed bank windows with iron bars, the sound of shattering glass echoing through streets that had once rivaled Paris in elegance. Riot police fired tear gas into crowds of middle-class citizens who had never imagined they would be looting supermarkets to feed their families. By nightfall, 39 people lay dead. The catastrophe had been building for years. Through the 1990s, Argentina pegged its peso to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 rate, promising stability after decades of hyperinflation. Foreign investors loved the policy and poured money into the country. The government borrowed billions, assuming the good times would continue indefinitely, but the fixed exchange rate made Argentine exports expensive and uncompetitive. The economy contracted, tax revenues plummeted, yet the government kept spending, kept borrowing, kept promising that everything would work out. By 2001, the fiction could no longer hold. The government owed $132 billion to foreign creditors, the largest sovereign debt in history at that time. Bank deposits fled the country as Argentines converted pesos to dollars and transferred their savings abroad. The financial system teetered on total collapse. On December 1st, the government implemented the corralito, the little fence. Banks froze all accounts. Citizens could only withdraw $250 per week from their own money. A lifetime of savings became inaccessible overnight. A shopkeeper who had saved for retirement couldn't access his funds. A mother couldn't withdraw money to pay for her daughter's medical treatment. An elderly woman stood outside her bank branch, weeping, as security guards blocked the entrance. The rage was inevitable. Middle-class Argentines took to the streets banging pots and pans in a cacophony of fury. The protests turned violent. Looters ransacked grocery stores in poor neighborhoods. The president appeared on television urging calm, but his words meant nothing. He resigned and fled the presidential palace in a helicopter as protesters surrounded the building. Argentina cycled through 5 presidents in 2 weeks, each one lasting only days before resigning or being forced out. On December 23rd, the government officially defaulted on its debt. The peso's peg to the dollar shattered. The currency lost 75% of its value within months. A middle-class family that had saved $20,000 in a peso account woke up to find their savings worth $5,000. Life savings vanished not through reckless spending, but through government policy. 57% of Argentines fell below the poverty line. Unemployment hit 21%. Professionals rummaged through garbage bins looking for cardboard to sell. University-educated workers took jobs as street vendors or security guards. The country that had once been richer than France descended into third-world conditions. The 2001 crisis broke something fundamental in Argentine society. An entire generation learned that banks could not be trusted, that governments would steal your savings, and that planning for the future was pointless when the rules changed without warning. The golden country had become a cautionary tale. Argentina stumbled out of the 2001 collapse like a survivor crawling from wreckage. Between 2005 and 2010, the government restructured its defaulted debt, convincing most creditors to accept 30 cents on the dollar. High global commodity prices lifted the economy. Soybean exports generated billions. Growth returned, unemployment fell, and some Argentines dared to hope the nightmare had ended. But the underlying disease remained untreated. The government resumed its old habits immediately. Spending increased faster than revenues. When tax collection fell short, the central bank printed more pesos. Inflation crept back into daily life, first at 10% annually, then 15%, then 20%. Shopkeepers stopped pricing goods, instead writing prices on chalkboards they could erase and update each morning. In 2014, Argentina defaulted again. The situation was complicated, involving holdout creditors from the 2001 default who refused the restructuring deal and sued in U.S. courts. The government called it a technical default, but the result was the same. International credit markets slammed shut. The country couldn't borrow at any reasonable interest rate. The economy spiraled downward. By 2018, inflation hit 47%. The peso collapsed against the dollar. Capital fled the country in waves. Facing a full-blown crisis, Argentina turned to the institution it had demonized for decades, the International Monetary Fund. The government requested a bailout package of $57 billion, the largest loan in IMF history. Protesters filled the streets of Buenos Aires, burning effigies and waving signs denouncing the IMF as imperialist vultures. But the government had no choice. The money arrived with strict conditions: cut spending, reduce the deficit, stop printing money to cover budget shortfalls. The reforms inflicted immediate pain. Poverty rates climbed back above 35%. Then 2020 brought a global pandemic and the final blow. With the economy locked down and unable to generate revenue, Argentina defaulted for the 9th time in its history. The government restructured $65 billion in foreign debt, forcing creditors to accept significant losses once again. By 2023, inflation raged at over 100% annually. Argentines stopped using pesos for anything beyond immediate transactions. Savings went into U.S. dollars, purchased on black markets at rates far above the official exchange rate. Real estate transactions, car sales, and major purchases all happened in dollars. The country had effectively abandoned its own currency without formally admitting it. Argentina had become a zombie economy, technically alive but unable to function normally. The cycle that began in 1890 had become permanent. Every attempt at recovery led inevitably back to the same disaster. Argentina's repeated failures defy simple explanations. The country possesses enormous natural wealth. The Pampas remains some of the most fertile agricultural land on Earth. Mineral deposits lie beneath Patagonia. The population is educated, with literacy rates comparable to developed nations. Yet Argentina has defaulted 9 times, while countries with fewer advantages maintained economic stability. The answer lies not in resources, but in choices repeated across generations. Populism became Argentina's political addiction. Politicians discovered they could win elections by promising benefits the government couldn't afford. Subsidized utilities, generous pensions, bloated public payrolls, and price controls bought votes in the short term. Each administration expanded these programs, knowing their successors would inherit the consequences. Voters rewarded immediate benefits and punished anyone who suggested austerity. The political system created incentives for irresponsibility. When tax revenues fell short of spending commitments, the government faced a choice: cut programs, raise taxes, or print money. Cutting programs meant losing elections. Raising taxes on the wealthy elite who controlled agricultural exports proved politically impossible. That left one option. The central bank ran the printing presses, creating new pesos to cover budget deficits. This monetary expansion caused inflation, which functioned as a hidden tax on everyone holding pesos. Savings evaporated, prices rose, and the currency weakened. But the political benefits came immediately while the costs accumulated gradually. Argentina lacked the institutional discipline to break this pattern. The country never developed strong independent institutions that could resist political pressure. The central bank operated as an arm of the executive branch, printing money on demand. The judiciary failed to enforce contracts consistently. Property rights remained insecure. Successive governments changed the rules constantly, making long-term planning impossible for businesses or individuals. Foreign creditors enabled the addiction. After each default, Argentina would eventually restructure its debt and promise reform. International banks and investors, hungry for higher returns, would lend again within a few years. The country borrowed new money to pay interest on old debts, running a national-scale Ponzi scheme. Each cycle of borrowing lasted until the math became impossible, then collapsed into another default. The pattern persisted because it served powerful interests. Politicians won elections, public employees kept jobs, and connected businesses received contracts and subsidies. The costs fell on savers, the middle class, and future generations. By the time each crisis hit, the politicians responsible had moved on or blamed their predecessors. Argentina's curse was not fate or bad luck. It was a system designed to produce exactly these results, maintained by people who benefited from it despite the periodic catastrophes. Argentina's century of failure offers brutal lessons that extend far beyond South America. For nations, the message is clear: you cannot spend more than you collect indefinitely. Borrowing to fund current consumption rather than productive investment creates a trap. Printing money to cover deficits transfers wealth from savers to debtors through inflation. Populist promises that ignore economic reality eventually collide with mathematics, and mathematics always wins. For individuals, Argentina demonstrates why trusting governments to manage your wealth is dangerous. Argentines who kept savings in local banks saw their money confiscated or devalued repeatedly. Those who diversified into foreign currencies, hard assets, or overseas accounts preserved their wealth. The lesson: governments facing fiscal crisis will take whatever they can reach. The question now is whether Argentina can finally break free. In 2023, Javier Milei won the presidency on a radical platform. The libertarian economist proposed eliminating the central bank, adopting the US dollar as official currency, and slashing government spending by half. His election represented desperation more than ideology. Argentines had tried everything else. Whether dollarization can work remains uncertain. The attempt itself acknowledges a profound truth. Argentina has destroyed its own currency so thoroughly that abandoning it entirely might be the only solution. A century of defaults has led to contemplating national monetary suicide. That might be the harshest lesson of all. A cafe on Avenida de Mayo in Buenos Aires, 2024. An elderly man sips coffee beneath French architecture built during the Golden Age. His pension buys less each month as inflation devours the peso. Across the street, a young professional checks dollar exchange rates on her phone, planning her escape to Spain. The Teatro Colón still stands, a monument to what Argentina once was. But the country that could have been Europe's rival in the New World instead became a warning. From richest to defaulted 9 times in 100 years. Not because of bad luck or foreign conspiracies, but because of choices made and repeated by people who refused to learn. History punishes those who ignore its lessons. Argentina is proof.